Hello, this is Matt, and this is a tutorial about how to get basic geometry and textures into Godot Engine 3. I'm using Linux and I'm using Godot 3.0 Beta 2, but this will probably work for any 3.0 release, and you can do it on any operating system. What you're going to need is a copy of Blender, and also a copy of this Godot Collada exporter. You can use the Blender Collada exporter, but it doesn't work great a lot of the time, so I prefer to use this one. Also, I know there's support for GLTF in newer Godot releases. However, I have not been able to get the GLTF exporter to work, so hopefully that's fixed in the future. This is how you have to do it as of January 2018. Besides these things, you're also going to need some sort of PBR texture. If you're coming from Godot 2.1 or you're new to this, you might not know that PBR textures are different than the old model of having, like diffuse, specular, normal, and that they are physically based and, they reproduce different effects in different situations, which is great, but also complicates things in terms of having to import stuff. So I've gone to this website called freepbr.com, and I'm just going to choose a random texture here. We'll go with some sort of brick. I kind of like this modern brick down here, so I'm going to choose that. And on this particular website, you've got two different files that you can download. You want to choose the Unreal Engine file because it uses the same shading model as Godot. Unity has two different models. There's a specular gloss workflow and the metalness, roughness model that Unreal and Godot use, but this is probably going to be glossiness. So we want to use this one. So I'm going to grab that. And while that's downloading, I'm going to create my Godot folder. And I like doing this because it makes it easier to organize things when I start to get larger and larger projects. So I'm going to create a folder. I'm going to call it, we'll just call it geometry test. And in my geometry test folder, I'm going to create another folder. I'm going to call it meshes. This is for the actual physical geometry. And then I'm going to have another folder, and I'm going to call it textures. And I'm doing this for organization also because Godot likes to just import anything that goes, automatically import anything that goes into the folder. So I like to have things pre-organized so I don't have to move things around and have it waste time on re-importing stuff. So in my meshes folder, I'm going to call something, we'll just call it test cube, because I'm going to make a cube to make this as easy as possible. And then, so that's completely set up. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Godot 3.0 file, and I've already tried to do this once, so we're going to remove that and go to new project, go to browse, and we'll go back to desktop and we'll geometry test and select current folder, and we'll just call it geometry test. So that will bring up us our Godot engine, and this is just the default 3D view that you're going to see when you start Godot 3. And you'll notice our two folders for meshes and textures have already sort of shown up. Now, when I work in Godot, I like to save my blends in the same folder where I'm going to do my exporting, so that's how we'll do it in Blender. The second thing you're going to need is going to be this Better Collada exporter. And we talked about that before, so you need to have this installed. I'm not going to go over how to install it because I use Linux and it could be different for Windows or Mac. Just know that in Blender you have to have it installed, and you can find that by going to the user preferences and add-ons and searching for Collada, and it's here. There's also another Godot export manager. That's for a little bit more advanced stuff, and we won't be using that today. Alright, so you're going to look at your default Blender scene, and all this stuff is here. I'm going to reset the cursor. And we're just going to import this beautiful, lovely cube into Godot 3, but we're going to do it in a textured manner. So I'm going to get rid of the camera and the light, And oh, by the way, this assumes that you sort of know how to use Blender a little bit. If you don't, please go through like a 10 to 15 minute, introductory Blender course. This tutorial is not for teaching you Blender. There are a ton of tutorials to do that, and there are a lot of good ones out there, so just go searching if you don't know how to do that. Okay, I'm going to call this particular cube, we'll just call it test cube. And I will change it, sorry, I'll also change it in the object data, just so it lines up. Now, I'm also going to change it to the cycles renderer so the textures show up correctly. We need a material, and auto comes with a material, but we're just going to call it, I'm going to change the material to test cube material, and that's a beautiful, nice name, at least it's consistent. So when we look at the cube, the first thing we're going to need to do, and this is setting up any model for Blender for export, is to UV map it. So I'm going to go through the standard Blender UV mapping workflow, which is to split the window, change this to UV map, and then I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm just going to hit unwrap. So we've got an unwrapped cube and all this stuff. Now, what I didn't do before, and I forgot to do, is to set up my textures. So if I go back to this brick texture, I'm just going to pull this brick texture into the textures folder in my game folder. So you can also see Godot working here when I do that. It auto imports everything, which can kind of get annoying sometimes. So I almost wish, if there are any Godot 3 developers watching this, that there's just a more traditional sort of way of having an import dialog to import files into Godot, but maybe that'll change later. So we'll go back to Blender here. Now, materials, the way you do materials and things have changed. In Blender with cycles. So we're gonna go to the material surface. You can use nodes there, and the surface you want is going to be not diffuse but principled. So this principled shader will give you all the inputs that you'll need to use the new PPR shading model. Now, we're not going to go into more complicated things here because it's just a basic tutorial. But normally I would use nodes and switch to the node editor, and then you'll see the principled shader, and we can change all of this stuff. But for now, because I'm working on a laptop and we're only doing the basic geometry, we're just going to do it this way. Now, the other consideration is that materials, even using this specific Collada importer and all that stuff, do not auto-import with the file. You have to link them up in Godot later. Hopefully this is going to change. So this whole way of doing things will probably change in the next 6 months. It'll change either as the Collada importer improves, or as GLTF becomes more and more viable. Okay, so I've got all these principled inputs. I'm just going to go here to base color, and I'm going to go to image texture, and you can go to open, and we can find our geometry test textures. And I'm going to choose the where's the base color. So that's going to give us our brick texture, and then I can switch it to texture, and we'll see this nice brick texture. And if I go into edit mode and I look at the UVs, you'll see that it just is mapping to every face on the cube. Now, however, I don't kind of really like how that's mapping. There's no real vertical bricks like that. So I'm just going to hit this rotate and rotate 90 degrees, and that'll fix the cube texture so it's working like that. So now we have something that looks like the texture will roughly look in game. However, you'll know that I'm not using any of these other ones. I'm not using the metallic, the specular, or the roughness, or the AO, or the normal. And that's because I'm just going to have to link them up in Godot anyway, so it doesn't really behoove me to use these. All I'm using the texture for is just to make sure the alignment is proper. Now, here's an optional step for using Godot. If you want to use the light mapper, which is not using the real-time GI probe, you need to set up an extra UV set. Now, sometimes if you import something, you can make it work so it will auto-create the second UV map. However, because I also work in Unreal 4, it's easier for me to just set this up in Blender. So how you do that is you go to the object data, and you'll see this UV map down here. So I'm going to rename that. I'm going to make that UV map 0, so that's going to be my texture UV map. My light map UV map is going to be here. I'm going to call it UV map 1 because Godot imports these sequentially, so it automatically looks for the second UV map and whatever the next one is. So if I go back to my cube and I select it in edit mode, obviously that's not going to be the right one. So I need to hit unwrap, and I need to hit light map pack, and it'll come up with this sort of thing here. All of this is good, and I'm just going to increase the margin just a little bit so it packs correctly. And I don't like that because these islands are too close together. So I might hit pack islands. Oops, pack islands, and that will give you this margin here, and you can sort of separate this just a little bit. So now you'll see me switching back to the UV map. So this is the texturing UV map, and this is the light mapping UV map that Godot will use for the light mapper. And if you notice how I'm doing it here, you'll want a lot of padding, because that's the way to avoid light mapping seam problems when you use a light mapper. Okay, so all of this is ready to export. I'm going to go back to object mode. I'm going to select the object, which is selected, and then I'm going to go to export, and we're going to find the better collada thing down here. In this case, I'm only doing the mesh, so I'm going to hit mesh. I'm going to hit selected objects. This is so you don't try to export the other stuff with it. I'm going to go into geometry test and into my meshes file, and go to my test cube, and I'm just going to call it test cube, like this, collada. These other things, active layers, exclude control bones, all this other stuff is for animation. You don't need to really worry about it. I would hit the triangulate just to have it, but the rest of the stuff isn't going to come in anyway, so you don't need to worry about it. So I'm just going to hit export. Now if we catch this, you can see Godot automatically importing that thing. Now if we go into meshes, go into test cube, you'll see this stuff. And what happens is that it creates a material for it. So now we need to link the materials. So I'll double click on this material icon. I'll pull this over a bit. And the first thing we need to do, for some reason as of Godot 3, it uses a bad material lighting model. It uses a Lambert lighting model by default. So that's what we really need to change, because it's not going to sync up correctly with the PBR workflow. So the first thing you need to do when you're importing any PBR texture or material, you need to hit Burley here. So that'll, let's see, now we don't need to change that. So Burley will make your textures physically correct and match things like Substance Painter or Substance Designer, or any of the textures you're going to get off that free PBR website. Okay, so going back, this is the test cube material. So we need to link the albedo, so I'll go here and load, go to textures, my bricks, and find the base color. And then I'll go to the roughness. I'll set the roughness to 1 because it's a rough object. And then what this does is it makes it completely rough, and then the texture will modulate the roughness. So we need to find the roughness, which is over here. And then we also need a normal map. It's going to be here, so we'll hit enable, texture, load, and go to the my bricks. So now we have the basics of a PBR texture. As far as metallic, if you had a metallic object, you would want to use this, but I'm going to set it to 0 because it's a completely unmetallic object. Now, So this is completely set up, and if I wanted right now, I could drag this test cube into the scene, but first of all, I want to do some organization. Because Godot uses a hierarchical sort of organization model where all nodes are equal and all nodes can be parented to one another, you need to be careful about how you set up your nodes. This is probably the most basic way to be able to do it. So I'm going to add a child node over here. I'm going to add just a generic spatial node, right? And you can see that. And because I'm going to link the test cube, I'm going to call that spatial node test cube. And then, now we're going to drag in our test cube. And you'll see it, and because I'm on a laptop, this is probably going to take forever because for some reason it re-encodes textures. But it's going to re-encode all the textures, and it will show up in game. Normally this should be a lot faster, but because I'm recording and my laptop's pretty slow, we have to wait. If there are any Godot 3 developers out there, it might be really nice if you could do a check that you've already re-imported assets so it doesn't do this every time I import a mesh, but you never know. Alright, so now we've got a cube that is kind of like, looks like a cube with a texture on it. Now this is kind of in the wrong place, so I'm going to set the transform, or the translation to 0, 0, 0, and that'll bring us to the root. Now obviously you can't see this cube well, it's not well lit, it's getting some ambient lighting from this sky sphere. However, we don't want that, so I'm going to go back up here, I'm going to parent a directional light. Now we're getting more lighting. So you can see, if you look at the material, that it's relatively rough. It looks like it does in the picture. And you're getting some nice sort of shadowing. You can even see some shadowing off the normal map. If I wanted to change the lighting direction, I could go here. I could change the energy to make it a little bit brighter. Or I could also, rotate the light like this to do something like that. Also, just as an aside, if you want to change the actual physical properties of the skybox, you need to go back and to edit this default environmental tree here. Anyway, that should be it, and I hope you enjoyed it. I will try to update this video if we get a good GLTF exporter that actually works, or if there's a way to automatically import and link up your textures using maybe an improved collage exporter. But for now, this is how you have to do it with Godot 3 using the PBR shading model. Thanks.